All right, welcome to another episode of the Collector Car Podcast. Now, I just came back early from Arizona trying to beat the cold, and I'm currently in Ohio, snowed in, and about 12 inches of snow. So I figured let me do a little quick recap as far as some of the cool things that happened in Arizona. Overall, it was a very strong sale. A couple days, all the auction houses had nice results, but I wanted to talk specifically about the Ferrari market because, as you know, it went crazy a couple weeks ago or a week and a half ago, whenever it was, for the yellow Ferrari sale, the Bachmann sale at Mecum, and that truly was an outlier. But it's not until you see the follow-up results whether or not you know if it truly was an outlier. Now, stay tuned because I do have an interview with the Stiglette, a very enthusiastic and awesome race car driver that you'll want to hear his story for sure. But before we get to that, I did want to review some of these Ferrari results from Arizona. Now, there were only 20 cars that sold where there was an estimate provided against them. So I took out the Barrett Jackson results because those were no reserve cars. So I didn't really have a gauge in which to say, hey, these overperformed or underperformed. But the end results were pretty interesting. It just seems like they weren't really affected by the crazy numbers from in Kissimmee. Now, it's a 90% sell-through rate across those 20 cars, so 2 cars did not sell, but 35% of the cars actually sold under the low estimate, so there's not this hyper excitement around the Ferrari market. People are keeping a level head and really thinking about what they're bidding on before they buy a car. Now, there were 2 cars that surprised me a little bit. One of them was an Enzo, which wasn't really that surprising. It went over the high estimate by about $2 million. Now, that's understandable. That was affected by the results in Kissimmee because you had the orange one sell for around $11 million, and then famously you had the custom ordered from new yellow one sell for around $17 million. So the estimate was $5 to $6 million. Now, those estimates were put together way before the Mecum sale, and it's hammered at $8 million, and it was a red car. So red is the most common color in Enzos. 85% approximately were red. So it's the one-off colors or the rare colors that really seem to drive the Ferrari market. The other one that was really interesting was, I guess 2 more that were very interesting. The Ferrari F40 did not sell when it crossed the auction block, but it did sell afterwards. So it sold either Saturday sometime or even on Sunday. So that one did hammer sold around mid-estimate or low estimate. And then the one that really surprised me was the 2012 Ferrari 812 GTS Inspirazione. Now, this one was very cool, very interesting. And what was interesting about it is I was managing the Sotheby's Motorsports kind of area, and I could see that car along with 40 other cars. And that was the only car that people talked about as they casually walked by me. There was always people checking that car out. There's always like a little crowd around it. So the estimate was $500,000 to $600,000. They hammered at $900,000, which I really wanted to watch that one because it is new, last of the front engine V12s, and special ordered. So my takeaway was the Ferrari market is doing just fine. It's not overheated. People are being wise when they bid on Ferraris, and most importantly, they do go after special cars when those show up. But that's not just relegated to the Ferrari market. That is anytime you see a really special, rare car come across the auction block, people are really going to go after it. So let's take a listen from my sponsors real quick. Please support them. And then we'll get to our interview with the Stiglette. If you own a collector car, you already know it deserves more than a standard insurance policy. NCM Insurance specializes in agreed value coverage designed specifically for classic collector and enthusiast vehicles. From weekend drivers to serious collectors, they understand how these cars are used, stored, and protected. To learn more about protecting your collector car the right way, visit ncminsurance.com. Coverage built for the cars you care about. Imagine a journey so rare it only happened once. That's the spirit behind Once. Exclusive, one-time only adventures that will never be repeated. Our next experience, American Muscle Legends, takes you trackside with the most iconic cars in history, complemented by luxury accommodations and behind-the-scenes access you simply can't buy. Spots are limited. When it's gone, it's gone. You can learn more at discoveronce.com/muscle. All right, welcome to the Collector Car Podcast. I'm very excited about this guest today because I think he's the youngest person I've ever had on the Collector Car Podcast. So I'd like to welcome Joey Andrews. How you doing, buddy?
Doing great. Thank you so much for having me, Greg.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate it. So we met, tell me again, we met at Monterey at the Cantina at a kind of like Griot's Garage dinner. Is that where we met?
Yeah, so Griot's Garage and Michael Dolphin, who's been one of my mentors, we all had dinner together at Baja Cantina to start off Monterey Car Week in August of last year, and that's where we met.
Yeah, and I have to give a shout out to Tim McNair. He's been on the podcast before. He gave me the introduction to Richard and how I ended up at that dinner. And so it's like the car community continues to expand. It's not really that big. So it's great meeting people at different events and then seeing them at future events. So really cool to meet you. And I think probably the thing that caught my ear, I guess, was the fact that you're an upcoming racer and your nickname's the Stiglette. So if you would just kind of tell us what you're up to today, and I'll ask you some questions about how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, so today, currently racing in Spec MX5, which is the feeder series to Mazda's MX5 Cup Series, chasing my dream. Racing started purely as a passion from watching Top Gear, hence the name Stiglette. And I first started as a car enthusiast. I went to car shows. I was just liking road cars. I liked driving. I didn't have a driver's license yet, so I'd be a passenger with my mom or my dad. And from there, one day I said, I really want to go driving. I want to feel what it's like. And so I'm on indoor go karting. And the second I drove an indoor go kart, I'm like, wow, this is really cool. I want to be a racing driver. And that's kind of how the whole journey really begun. It was just out of that curiosity and that love for cars and driving.
All right, well, that's awesome. And for our listeners, you're talking about the original Top Gear, not the
Of course.
relaunched one, right? With James May and Richard Hammond and Jeremy Clarkston,
Clarkson.
right? And the Stig was the mysterious driver, always wore white, always had a helmet on. You never knew who he was. Found out later, for the most part, it was Ben Collins. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yeah.
Okay. And probably the most epic moment, I know, maybe in automotive history on TV, because that show literally got 50 million viewers. I mean, it was just insane what they were at their peak. But was when they had the Stig take off his helmet and just for fun, it was Michael Schumacher underneath there. Do you remember that event?
I do remember that event. So that was a fun episode. I remember they were driving the Ferrari FXX, the one that was based on the Enzo. And at the time, Ferrari had this rule that only a Ferrari driver could drive the car. So the Stig couldn't drive the car. And they somehow got Michael Schumacher to be the Stig and decided to make the grand reveal. And that was pretty incredible because at the time, I didn't actually know that it was Ben Collins. I don't even know if they put his name in the credits to try to keep it as secretive as possible. And I remember I was like, wow, okay, this is actually the Stig. This is crazy. I can't comprehend this.
Yeah, it was quite an event. I do remember that. And I don't know, I don't think it was until the show was over that they mentioned it was Ben Collins. There is a behind the scenes kind of thing interviewing him. And if I remember correctly, he was on initially on the credits. And so people started figuring, it didn't say who he was or what his job was, but he was just, they're like, well, who's that guy? We don't know who that guy is. And they started putting it together. So they, very early in Top Gear, they took his name out of the credits and he had to show up secretively and all that kind of stuff. So that's who you chose to name yourself after, right?
Exactly. Exactly. The Stig's always who I've looked up to, and that's really where the journey begun, was Top Gear.
Oh, that's cool. Now, what series? I see Mazda behind you. What series are you currently racing in?
Yes, so currently I race in Spec MX5, which is a series that's part of the SCCA Super Tour. And the way I started racing Mazdas was out of karting, I was trying to figure out, okay, my goal is to win Le Mans, but obviously I got to get into car racing. And in America, there's quite a lot of options in sports car racing. But my karting coach told me about the Mazda Motorsports ladder system where you start in Spec Miata, which is the first and second generation cars from the 80s and 90s. And then you jump into Spec MX5, which is the third generation car from the 2000s. And then ultimately the pinnacle series is MX5 Cup and IMSA, which is the current ND chassis. And so I started racing Spec Miata for a year in Southern California, finished third in the championship, was the highest finishing rookie, and said, I'm going to come back another year. We're going to really put a great season together. All that learning that we had in season one, won the championship. And the really exciting part about that was, in addition to winning the Southern California Championship with NASA, I got invited to the Mazda Shootout.
Hmm.
And the Mazda Shootout is this program where Mazda looks at drivers from all across the country and they give them an opportunity to compete to win a season in the next level, which for me would be Spec MX5 and be part of the Mazda Motorsports factory team. And a competition at Homestead Miami Speedway in 2024. And I won the competition, which is how I got the amazing Mazda check behind me. And I got to race for the Mazda Motorsports factory team last year in Spec MX5 all across the country in the SCCA Super Tour.
Wow, that's amazing. So, where does it go from there? Walk me through the hierarchy of like kind of what your goal is, from a career perspective to get to Le Mans.
Yeah, exactly. So for me to get to Le Mans, I think going the sports car racing route and GT cars is the most realistic way. So currently in Spec MX5, the next series up is MX5 Cup. MX5 Cup is a support series in IMSA, so now you're racing on the pro weekends, and the series gets just that bit more even, crazily competitive. And then from there, most drivers transition into GT4, and GT4 you can race pretty much anywhere around the world. And then from there, obviously the pinnacle of GT racing is GT3. And at that point, you're racing in IMSA, you're racing in WEC, you're racing in, a high level in SRO. And that's kind of the dream, is ultimately be picked up by a manufacturer, go race those cars, and ultimately, race at Le Mans. That's the dream I've been chasing since I was a little kid and I was 11 years old.
That's awesome. Yeah, so go back to that if you would. What I know you mentioned it briefly, but what was that moment? Was it the moment you got into a go-kart? Like what exactly was that moment?
Yeah, so there's kind of a few moments I think about. My initial foray into cars was very interesting because neither of my parents come from motorsport or even really come from an automotive background. So when I was in elementary school, my best friend Derek, his family works on a bunch of classic cars and mainly 1950s Cadillacs. So he'd always show up to school in one of these cars. And I thought to myself, I'm like, man, this guy's cool. And so we became best friends all the way in kindergarten. And we would read car magazines at lunch together and talk about cars. And he said to me one night, he's like, Joey, you got to go watch a show called Top Gear. Yeah, I think you're going to like it. I'm like, all right. So I go home, I watch Top Gear, instantly fall in love with the show. And then from there, that's where, my spark for driving begun. And yes, when I first drove a go-kart, that's where I said, you know what? I want to go be a racing driver. I want to go be the next Stig. And hence, the name the Stiglette was born is like, that's what I'm chasing after. I'm going to be a mini Stig. And, that's the dream.
It's nice that that happened to you earlier in your life. I recall back not that long ago, but like I was in my early 30s and I did an outing where we did like go-karts. It wasn't the series go-karts, but they were still, like Andretti racing go-karts. And I had to take the class and everything. And I was behind the track instructor and he led the charge and he was obviously awesome. And I just said, I'm going to give it my all. And so I ended up on his tail at the end of the race. And he turned around and he was shocked that anybody was even close to him. And so at that moment, I was like, oh man, I think I missed a potential calling, like I'm not saying I'm a great driver. I'm just saying in that one moment, I was able to keep up with the lap lead instructor just on pure will. And so sometimes I look back and say, oh, what could have been?
Yeah, exactly. That's where I'm grateful that I found my passion at such a young age because, I think about it. If I didn't, like, I don't know what I'd be doing now. I mean, it's crazy to think that if I never met Derek at such a young age, like my life would be completely different.
Now I know it's a really difficult world, racing, because you're relying on sponsorships and your whole family, you got a whole crew and all this kind of stuff. Do you have a day job to help with the racing, or are you 100% racing 100% of the time?
So to answer your question, it's been on and off. So after graduating high school, I decided to take a gap year and use that year to really focus on racing full time in the jump to cars. Because as you mentioned, obviously the hardest part of racing, until you're at the very top level, you're not getting paid, and you have to bring funding to the teams to race. So I actually spent my first gap year working for my friend Tony, who has a shop in California called Strictly German Auto. And basically, I started as a customer at Tony's shop, and I said to Tony, I'm like, hey, I'm looking for a part-time job. Do you know anyone? He's like, you want to come work here? And I'm like, I don't know how to work at a shop. I don't know how to work on cars. And he said, I'll teach you. And that was the most amazing year I got to spend with him learning about cars. And I think what was really great about that was it taught me the skill of not purely just wrenching on cars, but understanding the engineering of these cars. And that way, when I'm at the track and we're trying to diagnose problems or give feedback to the engineers, I can be that much more accurate and have that much better communication skills. And then from there, I went to college for a year, chasing my other goal of becoming a commentator in Formula One, going after a sports journalism degree. And then what I realized was after my second semester in college, doing college and racing full time, now that I was racing nationally for the Mazda team, was impossible. And so I decided this year to take another gap year. And currently, right now, it's just 100% on racing. Obviously, the hard part, my coach Enzo says, which I think is a great word, is as an up and coming driver, you're a race entrepreneur. You have the on track stuff. You have to be fast. You have to have good racecraft. You have to have good discipline in your training and you're practicing, all that stuff. But at the same time, you got to have that entrepreneurial side of how are we going to get the funding to race? You got to go network. You got to go meet people. You got to go to events, and you got to go find every opportunity out there. And so for me, it's kind of this full-time job now of, racing as much as possible, when that allows in both time and money, but then also, you got to go find every opportunity in networking. So, a few weeks ago, I was at PRI in Indianapolis, freezing in the snow, trying to network as much as possible there and stop. But I love it. I wouldn't trade anything for it.
That's funny because I was actually at PRI as well, networking. So I wish I knew that. I could have caught up. That would have been cool. I actually interviewed Mike, president of SEMA, while I was there. So go back at this point, probably 5 or 6 episodes, and you'll hear my interview with Mike. And that was really cool because he basically says in his industry, there's wide open from a jobs perspective and everything. So that's really cool. Well, that does sound like a lot. And now, do you own your current race car? How does that work?
Yeah. So when I first started racing Spec Me Out, I rented that car from a team. And then when I raced for the Mazda team, that was their own car. But then in 2026, I'm going to be completely independent because the Mazda is this season. And yeah, that car I own outright. And we brought it home to California for the winter. So it's currently at a shop here called WR Technica, who's one of my sponsors. And so basically, we're using it through a little bit of testing in the winter. And then our first race of the season is actually in California in January and February. So thought it's great to have the car home, be able to bring it to events, use it. And it's kind of cool that, at this level, you still get to own the race cars and really have that personal touch with them.
Now, have you integrated the racing simulators into your training as well?
Yeah.
Like, talk about that because I know you're probably of the generation where it made a big transition from kind of cool to necessary, I would imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. It's 100% necessary. And for me, the simulator training, it comes in two things. I would think with sim racing, where people get a little bit confused, is you can go the route of trying to become an online professional sim racer, which many drivers have done, and that's an amazing route. And then there's the other side now, which is really cool, of drivers like me who are using it to practice and learn tracks. Last year, all the tracks I went to, it was my first time racing at them. I'd never been to Sebring, Homestead, Road Atlanta, VIR, Mid Ohio, Road America, Watkins Glen. And obviously, because those tracks are literally the other side of the country to where I live, my only way of practicing them and learning them was on the simulator. And especially when you're on a limited budget where you can't just go do endless testing, the simulator is essential. And what's great now is the technology on the simulators has gotten so good, and it's only improving. So you think about, from the pedals to the steering, the feel that's really, really close to the real car. And you can also adjust it so much. So you can build that muscle memory. But also the physics model of these cars, we're now able to do the exact same lap times on the simulator as we do in real life. And we can overlay that data from real life to the simulator. So if you want to experiment with things like setup, you could. But also, if you're just trying to learn a driving technique or learn these tracks, our ultimate goal is that you spend so much time in the simulator learning it that when you show up in real life for the first time, you feel like you already know the track like the back of your hand.
I can see that being really valuable because back in my Mario Super Karting days, I got really good at like some of those ones. So I can imagine. I mean, you can almost do it in your sleep when you do the sim so much. Now, is that one where, because I know you could buy a sim for your personal use, is that one you have personally, or is that where you can go someplace and rent time on one? Because I know they can get very complex and very detailed.
Yeah, they can, and it totally depends on what you want to do. I personally have a sim at my house, and that's obviously amazing because it's literally in this room behind me, so I can practice on it anytime. But there are places now where, say you don't own a simulator, but you want to go try one out, you can go out there and try these places out. And what's cool also is a lot of these, sim centers that have, 20 simulators in a room, you can not only can you race your friends against on there, but they've got motion sims and they've got, multi screens and all these cool technologies that if you want to try to implement to your own sim before making such a huge investment, you're able to try that out. And that's, I think, a really cool part because one thing about motorsport that's really frustrated me when I was first getting into it 10 years ago was accessibility was the biggest challenge. Everyone talks about the financial part, but I think there's also a case of no one knew about racing, especially until Drive to Survive came out on Netflix about Formula One. None of my friends talked about racing. And I think now with sim racing, it's this case of you can literally go in there, learn driving, and not have this massive commitment of being a full-time racing driver. And it's opened so many doors already for so many people. And I think when I look of how sim racing developed in just the last 5 years alone since COVID, I think when you look at 10 years down the road, it's going to be the future of grassroots motorsports, especially for the younger generation who they can't afford to go racing yet full time.
Yeah, that was something Mike said from the PRI interview was these sim racers, yeah, they might be 15 to 20 to 30 grand or whatever, but that could be just one season of practicing, or whatever. I mean, like the cost, yeah, it's an initial investment, but when you compare it to karting for multiple years, it's an interesting transition that's going on in the industry for sure. Now, you mentioned some sim racers doing that full time. That's in more of the esports kind of championship stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And what's really cool now is we're seeing this bridge between, professional esports sim drivers and the real drivers. So there's a lot of drivers I race with who they are really, really good on programs like iRacing, and they're some of the best in the world. And yet I know them from my local track, and I'm like, oh, that's just my friend. And then what's really cool is you're seeing a lot of professional drivers like Max Verstappen or Alex Palou who they're out there on iRacing all the time, and they're world class drivers in both real life and on the simulator. And if you're good enough on the sim, you can go race against them. And they have sim racing teams where they do full endurance events as well. And we're seeing a lot of drivers now who are getting driving opportunities purely through sim racing, which is absolutely unbelievable.
Yeah, I remember seeing, I think it was the Gran Turismo movie a couple of years ago,
Yes.
somewhat based on real life. And then obviously just saw the F1 with Brad Pitt, and they had a lot of sim racing going on in there as well. So it's really, really fascinating. Now, what was the biggest surprise? Obviously, you started this 10 years ago, you said, but what was the biggest surprise or understanding that really, I don't know. I don't know if it's the way, sponsor happening, the way like your expectations versus reality. What was the biggest gap you saw when you got into the racing world?
I think the biggest thing that surprised me the most really was actually this year I learned is that everything in racing and motorsport is super dynamic. I thought it was all really well structured and everything is super stable.
Right.
And what I've come to learn is that racing, it's like, they always make the joke that, oh, our sport operates at a really fast speed because obviously the cars are fast. But I think on the off track side, I feel like day to day and week to week, the sport is just constantly changing and evolving. And one thing I'm learning, and that's really shocked me from, when you see it from the outside to getting into it on a day to day basis, is just how on top of it you have to be. I think it's really blown my mind away that like the sport is just evolving and changing so fast and moving so fast. It's like it's this constant train of like, if you're not on it constantly, you feel like you're missing out and you're just planning so far ahead. And yet what's amazing is a lot of people don't really operate with plans because everything changes so fast. So you just constantly have to be flexible and dynamic. And that's been a big thing for me to learn is, how to be as flexible as possible and how to be as consistent as possible with that.
Right, right. Now that makes total sense. Now I know probably your biggest hurdle, your biggest challenge is sponsorship. So tell me, how does that work? So if I have a listener, I'll put the links inside the podcast description here. But what does it look like from a sponsorship perspective? Are there tiers of participation? Could it be a one-time sponsorship? How does that work in your world?
Yeah, so sponsorship's different for pretty much every driver and every team, depending on the series you race in. But the biggest thing for me when you race in Spec MX5 is you're in a series that doesn't have massive exposure because it's a junior series. And so it's all about personal relationships. All of my sponsors and partners I've had to date, it's all because I know them or I've met them through events. And it's this relationship where we know our connection is going to build together. Obviously, there's the side of some people are like, hey, I want to have my logo, I want to be associated, I want to be part of the journey. And that's amazing. And then you have people who say, I know you're racing right now, coming up through the grassroots levels, and you're going to, who, I have this crowdfunding program where they say, you know what, I want to have my name on the car. I want it as basic as possible, kind of like a wall of donors at a museum. And they want to come on at even a small level, like a $250 or $500 level. And so the way I've always done sponsorship is it's tailored to each individual person, and you keep it on the small scale at the grassroots level because it's not like, Formula One, NASCAR, IndyCar, where you have this amazing exposure where you're like, okay, I'm going to slap this logo on. It's going to be $100 million and you're going to have billions of views. The grassroots of motorsport is very different because you don't have massive audiences on the TV or at the track. And so it's really all about those connections and kind of what can you do for each other and how can you help each other out. And so a lot of cases with people, it's they have a business and they want to use me as a driver to help their business in some way. And we create a mutually beneficial relationship. And with all of my partners so far, that's what we've done. And that's what I'm trying to grow into the future. So then as we climb to the professional levels, I can offer them more and they can offer me more. And it's a win-win relationship.
Right, right. No, that's true. I mean, I've had some sponsors and have sponsors currently with the podcast, and it's very much you want to make sure it's as beneficial, if you can, more beneficial for them to be a participant, because that's why they want to, stick around and support you, obviously. So,
Yeah, exactly. It's all about relationships. That's the biggest thing I've learned is I think about my journey getting into motorsport where I didn't know anyone and how I've gotten myself pretty well established now. And I think about it's all about the people. That's really what makes the difference is it's who it's meeting people and just constantly getting your name out there. That's the biggest thing.
yeah, awesome. Well, what is your website for my listeners to learn more about what you do and how to support you?
Yes, the Stiglette.com. That is my website. We launched it in 2023, and that's where we've got everything from, my race results to the background story about me to kind of keeping people updated as well, my email newsletter. And of course, there's also info about sponsorship and really everything. I mean, we've really built this website as kind of a hub for the Stiglette. So whatever content you want to find about my racing, it's there.
Right, right. Well, you got big shoes to fill, obviously, naming yourself after the Stig. So I've got a question for you. So you're racing Mazdas, but what kind of cars do you like? Like if you had a classic car in your garage, what would you want it to be, or do you have one?
So this is actually a great question because the car that got me into racing is not a Mazda, but it's a Porsche. And what really got my initial driving interest started before I was even a car enthusiast or interested in cars is my mom has a 1999 Porsche Boxster that she bought in 2000. And I remember when she was pregnant with me, my dad said, "Oh, you need to get rid of the car. It's too small. It's not practical." My mom said, "I want to keep the car because maybe my kid will like driving it someday." And so we've had this exact car all the way to this date, 26 years later. And as a baby, she had the kill switch disabled, and that way I could go for rides in the car, or the airbag disabled, and that way I could go for rides in the car. And that was really the car where I taught myself how to drive manual by watching my parents. I remember I said to them one day, I was like, "I want to go to a parking lot and drive the Boxster." They're like, "What do you mean? You can't drive a stick shift." I'm like, "No, no, 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 I can. I've taught myself in the simulator. I've watched you drive it. I think I can." I only stalled once, but I was able to do some circles and go through the gears. And that's really where my interest began. And, my ultimate dream of Le Mans is racing for Porsche. So that's kind of where it started for me. And, I think also one thing about me is I'm that local Southern California kid who came up through the car culture scene with all the car shows. It wasn't for me purely just about the racing, but it's all about the road cars. Because for me, my passion for racing is all about my passion for driving. At the end of the day, I'm a car guy at heart.
Right. No, that's very cool. That's a great car. I actually bought my wife not that long ago an '05 Boxster S,
All
and I
right.
love that little thing. And it's a manual 6 speed, and we got it with only 1,900 miles on it. It's been in a collection since new, and now it has like 5,000 miles on it. And that's a really great car. So that's cool. So that's cool that you guys still have it. Yeah, that's really nice. Well, I appreciate you being on the Collector Car podcast. It's great to catch up after a little bit of time here.
Yeah. No, thank you so much. This has been amazing.